LA County could pay $400,000 settlement to church that fought COVID-19 mandates. This is really kind of a turnaround of events when you compare it to what I was talking about last year with Grace Community Church in LA County and that whole legal situation and everything that was going on. It was actually LA County that was coming down on Grace Community Church, but now it looks like Grace Community Church may end up getting $400,000 from LA County, and that's not the whole story. Before we look at this article in more detail, I do want to thank my viewer Dave out in California for letting me know about this situation, this update. And also thank you so much for getting my hat collection started by sending me this LA Dodgers hat last year. That really does mean a lot to me. So let's take a look at this article a little bit. It says Los Angeles County could soon settle a lawsuit against an evangelical church that defied a public health order barring indoor worship during the COVID-19 pandemic. Last August, the county sued Grace Community Church in Sun Valley for holding in-person indoor services that drew thousands of unmasked congregants. So it actually started with the county doing their health restrictions. The church didn't follow those, so the county ended up suing the church. And then it says that the church countersued the state, county, and LA city leaders, alleging violations of constitutional rights, including freedom of speech and religion. On Tuesday, the LA County Board of Supervisors will vote on a settlement agreement that would pay the church $400,000 for legal fees, with the money coming from the County Department of Public Health's budget. It's kind of an ironic situation that the church at first was looking to have to pay fines, and now it's the county that may end up paying out, and it's going to come from the public health budget, which is what this whole disagreement started with, was over a health issue and how to deal with it. It says, under the agreement, the state of California would also pay $400,000. So actually, in total, between the county and the state, it's possible that the church will end up getting paid $800,000, close to $1 million in payouts for this whole legal situation. County officials declined to comment until the supervisors vote. If approved, the settlement resolves all legal actions between the county and the church. An attorney for the church declined to comment because the settlement has not yet been approved. So obviously, in this situation, if you look at it in totality, it doesn't mean that the church is making money off of this. I'm sure the church had to spend a lot of money in legal fees. I don't really know what the total in legal fees would have been, but for whatever reason, in the way that they've worked it out, it looks like the church might get up to $800,000 in payouts. So anyway, you look at it from the church's perspective, this is really good news. Now, the article goes on here to talk a little bit more about the situation. This is from the LA Times, so it's going to come from a certain vantage point. Not really speaking super highly of Grace Community Church in the way that it frames things. It says, at the beginning of the pandemic, Grace Church's pastor, the Reverend John Macarthur, was supportive of following coronavirus mandates, since he has preached for years about obeying government officials. Now, that's something I'd love to hear in the comments. We tend to have a lot of discussion about this, and recently it seems like the discussion has ramped up even more. I talked recently about Todd Friel and some comments he made regarding obedience to the government versus James White. And that was particularly in regard to government mandates regarding the jab, or the V, as some people call it. But yes, John MacArthur has talked from Romans 13, for example, about obeying government. But the big question is, are there exceptions to that? And is there a biblical case for exceptions to that? And when are those exceptions in place? Anyway, it says that he told his followers that the church's live stream was an opportunity to reach non-believers in other countries. So that's what it's saying toward the beginning of the pandemic, that Pastor MacArthur said initially they would do live streams. And then it says last summer he changed his message, saying that there was no pandemic and the public health statistics were wrong, even as church members were falling ill and dying. It was all a government ploy to control Christians, he said. The church has seen multiple coronavirus outbreaks, including in one adult fellowship group that met in person. Now, these paragraphs here really, I think, show the bias of this article. You can tell there from just the way that they're portraying the situation. It says that church members were falling ill and dying, and that Pastor MacArthur was saying there was no pandemic. Now, he did say that, but one of the things that I would clarify here is that he is basically saying that the risk of what's going on with the coronavirus, COVID-19, doesn't merit them shutting down churches completely. And in that sense, in certain technical definitions as well, he's saying that there's no pandemic. I don't think MacArthur is saying that there's no disease and there's no risk whatsoever. But then when it talks here about church members falling ill and dying, I mean, again, yes, COVID-19 does pose a risk to some people. Some people, I'm sure, have died in Grace Community Church. That wouldn't surprise me. But when it talks about multiple coronavirus outbreaks, I mean, there are outbreaks everywhere if you look at the stats. So I don't think there's been any evidence that what Grace Community Church has done has been a particularly significant problem that has caused any more of an outbreak than in other places in that area. And again, when you look at the whole legal situation, it kind of speaks to, who has actually won the narrative here and who has had better evidence on their side in terms of how to deal with this whole situation. Now, I know there are so many people who are saying these churches are putting so many people at risk. But what a lot of people are missing, and you can go back, watch a video I just did, is there's so much bias, particularly against white evangelical Christians, and it makes it sound as if these people aren't doing anything to try to prevent the spread of disease. Just because they want to keep their church open and continue to worship doesn't mean they're not doing anything to prevent the spread of COVID. So that's something to keep in mind, but that tends to be how the whole situation is painted. Is it a risk to meet in church and that sort of thing? There is some level of risk, but again, what MacArthur has been saying is the risk doesn't merit shutting down churches the way that certain areas of the country have shut down churches or shut down their buildings and tried to keep them from meeting in person indoors. So it goes on to say that hasn't stopped MacArthur from continuing to fight COVID-19 protocols. He recently started offering a form letter for members to claim a religious exemption if their employer requires COVID-19 vaccination. So again, what you're really seeing here in MacArthur's perspective, I think, is it really has a lot to do with freedom of choice, freedom to worship. And so from his perspective, this is really about freedom. Same with the COVID-19 vaccination. I don't think the point here would be that nobody at all should get it, but you should have the freedom to choose. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that he is trying to support members who want a religious exemption. And then the end of the article here, in a recent letter to supporters of the MacArthur Charitable Trust, which finances various grace ministries, the pastor said the county had decided to drop all charges and pay the church's legal fees. He called this a monumental victory for Grace Community Church. We know that there is no circumstance that can cause the church to close, he wrote in the letter. The church is not only a building, but is the bride of Christ and exists to proclaim the truth. And that's the end of the article. I actually appreciate that they ended the article on that note, because I do think that that is really the message that he believes and that he's trying to get across here, regardless of what happens in a legal situation. And even if they close a church building, like with what happened at Grace Life Church near Edmonton with Pastor James Coates and their church, The church ultimately didn't close because even though the government there shut down the building is not the church. And so obviously at the end of the day, we're going to continue to meet as churches no matter what happens with our buildings. That's not going to prevent Christians from carrying out what God has called them to do. But it is good news in many ways, I think, from a lot of our perspective, that you actually see the legal system protecting rights. And I know a lot of people are going to take the other side of this, and they're going to say that MacArthur was wrong, Grace Community Church was wrong, the county was right to do what it did. But then again, you have to look at the legal outcome here. And if the county was so correct in the way that it approached the situation, why is it that the church is getting the payout? So if you have a different perspective on this, I'd love to hear it. It's always interesting to hear different points of view. But basically, it sounds like, and I think that the decision will be made Tuesday. I think that's when the vote is going to take place. So in a few days, we'll hear for sure what happens with this. But it is possible that LA County will pay the church $400,000, and then also I think the state of California may pay another $400,000. So Grace Community Church in total may receive a payout of $800,000. So that's the situation as it stands right now. I'll plan to give you an update when I hear more about this, what actually happens with this. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to this report and also some of my thoughts on this from a Frisch perspective.